Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a bunch of results over the past weekend. We had SpringFest Mexico as well as 2 JP events and introducing the set 2 meta. So lots to cover and just kind of seeing what decks are the best on the JP side and essentially how they translate into English very soon. If you guys need any coaching, Metafy link is in the bottom right hand corner. Feel free to book a session and we can get started. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button for all notifications on this channel. So BSF Mexico, generally Mexico, there's a lot of like wild stuff and that's what I love to see, right? Lots of creativity, lots of diversity, and this pretty much shows everything that I anticipated, right? Lots of different decks. So the first team brought Chronojet, Mushiking, and Shunui, and is the only team in the top 4 that brought Shunui, which is actually absolutely wild to me. Second place was Prism, Vivace, and Shouju Doji. Shouju Doji, I think, is a deck that I think a lot of people have kind of caught their eye on after Worlds, obviously winning Worlds, and you know, putting it in a team's format is pretty good too. Third brought Leonon, Youthberg, and Jujud, so pretty much the big 3 from set 13. And then fourth place was Jujud, Youthberg, and Leonon again. Wow, like literally carbon copies, but just in different seeding. So very cool to see, you know, a bunch of different decks. I think we're all very used to seeing Luards, very used to seeing Shunuis, but you know, a little bit of a mix up here is very cool to see. Then jumping into tri-regulation, so this is where it gets a little bit spicy, I think. So a lot of the teams brought Gurgit for V, so first, second, third all brought Gurgit, and then the fourth place brought Leopold. Each team brought something different for standard, so first place brought Jujud Ignis, second was Prism, third was the Shunui, and fourth was Luard. And then the first team for the premium slot brought Night Rose, second was an Angel Feather, so this is definitely a deck that we'll be looking into in just a sec. Third was Jewel Knights, and fourth is Gridora. So I'm going to look at that Angel Feather list. So this is not a Gize list, so that's kind of reassuring, I guess. So you know, you're still running OT. This is very Gavriel centric, so essentially you run like Nakir, I think that's what her name is, yes, to essentially find your Gavriel, to be able to ride up, get 2 protects off the Uriel if you go first. If you go second, then you go into like Hamiel. Hamiel then goes into this. Pretty much you get like a bunch of drives, you draw a bunch, right? And then essentially your kill turn is Basasiel to essentially have a full turn 3-card guard restrict, or like, no, it's not 3-card guard restrict, it's like number of damage in damage zone, number of cards in damage zone guard restrict. You kind of tie that with like a sentinel restrict in Hamiel as a rear guard, and then you have like Reflute to essentially pump that up, and then essentially have grade 3s and Soul to fulfill that. You also run this grade 2 Keta unit, right? And essentially what it does is pretty much bottom decks cards on the board. This is really good, especially if you're playing stuff like you know, that have like heavy intercepts or whatever, so you pretty much get rid of those. Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting inclusion, I gotta say. This deck actually doesn't play any sort of like multi-attack, I guess, so like, you know, you're really capitalizing on like your Jeff kills, your this doesn't even run the grade 2 that like Soul Blast and, you know, rescue checks, right? You also play this to essentially get a damage check. But yeah, it's pretty interesting how this deck kind of operates, because it runs Hamiel and the Feather Palace. So I think like you're essentially building like super big rear guards and then pretty much hitting them for like a ton of crit. Pretty much if you hit the OT, your opponent can't guard like Sentinel Guard, and that's pretty much it, right? The only deck that can really do that is Night Rose or Grand Blue in general. So I guess that's why, you know, you see Night Rose in the first place team, and this is the second place team. So yeah, very interesting list, I gotta say. We haven't really seen Angel Feather have any tops at all, so very big congratulations to this Angel Feather player. Much respect for bringing a very cool deck to Springfest. Then looking at the Leopold list, this is a Leopold list that runs the Gorilla, so nothing like the list that I played for last year's Springfest, but I think this deck hasn't really changed much. The only thing that is different is adding in the Jumbuck, which is the V promo. Otherwise, everything else is kind of the same. Gorilla, you pretty much like bomb your opponent's rear guards and then essentially you know, stand everything, which is like pretty gross. And then like, you know, you hit double front and your opponent just gives you a handshake, sun slip, and that's it, right? So yeah, very cool to see those two odd lists. I think like everything else is quite normal for us to see as well. Then this is where things get interesting. So we had two Japanese tournaments. So one of them is the Book of Toreka Festival, and then the other one was the Ultimate Vanguard Cup. So looking at this pie chart, this is the set 2, I guess, meta. So, you know, set 2 only just came out, and this is the teams format. So a lot of the teams brought Wellstar and Nadir, along with, you know, Shurnui, Raziel, and Blangmire. So that's pretty much the high popularity points, I guess, or the high, what's it called? Like high popularity of decks, and everything else is just kind of like one-offs, right? So the first team brought DRAJEWELED, Blangmire, and Vargas. Second was Shunui, Gendiv, and Chaos. Chaos is a pretty interesting list, well, deck in general. Third was Shunui, Chris Rain, and Lascaria. That is the Bug Girl. And then fourth place was an Eva, Welstra, and Luard. So just going to go through only like a few of these decks. So the first one being the DRAJEWELED deck. This deck is actually very interesting. Pretty much you're substituting a lot of your stuff for like some of the new stuff. So I know that this deck doesn't run the Grade 1 Draco Kid, and essentially replaces it with the Cycler card. And pretty much this fulfills kind of the same role, but with a cheaper cost, right? So essentially, this essentially means that you're CB1ing to draw, but you also get a soul charge and a boost later on, +5. Or you essentially substitute the Counterblast 1 for Energy Blast 3, which makes resources much easier for you to maintain. Another card that is really good is this new Grade 1. This Grade 1 is busted. So essentially when it's placed on rigor from hand, you CB1, check top 3, 1 to soul, 1 to hand, and 1 to discard. So essentially when you're digging through your deck, right, you start drawing stuff, and then pretty much you search this, you check your top 3. If you see Ignis, then if you don't have an Ignis, you add it to hand. If you put it in the drop zone, then your Nocturcio, which is your Grade 3 Dragon, essentially puts it back into soul. So essentially you are super selective with what you grab, and essentially it's trading itself as a 5k for a potential like trigger, which essentially equates to 10k more shield, right? Very, very strong, because essentially it makes it so that it also replaces the Grade 1 Draco Kid, because now you're selective on what you essentially draw off the top 3 instead of blindly drawing 1 and it being 5k, right? So your defense naturally increases, yeah? So I think this deck is very well constructed, and I think this deck or this particular player also did well in the Ultimate Vanguard Cup, but we'll talk about that in just a sec. So yeah, very cool list. Definitely a list that I will try in the very near future. Then looking at Blangmire. Blangmire is probably one of the decks that a lot of people are anticipating to be one of the best decks in the format. So Falcracia seems to be a staple for Blangmire just because of being able to put cards into soul, and this essentially just like gets a bunch of power, right? Sure, you don't get like the draw 1 because I think your Vanguard has to be like Grade 4 or something. But otherwise, like the fact that you're putting cards into soul, you're intercepting these off, and you know it's pretty good, right? Otherwise, like, you know, you're still running the crit guy that essentially gets +5k in crit. The Counterblast 1 check top 3 essentially soul charge will put 3 cards from top of deck into soul. If there is a trigger, then you draw 1. And then you play obviously the Blangmire booster, and you're also playing the anti-stride, anti-ride Grade 1. Well, kind of anti. Your opponent essentially has to discard for that. A lot of these decks are now running this order, and I think this order is very interesting because essentially you're trading this card for any card in your soul that essentially becomes a unit on the board. And if you like search like Falcracia, or like if you know, heal off this, then, you know, Falcracia is going to put it into soul. You have access to this for the next turn to essentially bind itself, accelerating the win con of Blangmire, so to be able to use Blangmire's divine skill, right? So lots of moving parts, but I think everything works synergetic with each other, and I think it's a very cool list to kind of see develop in the near future. This deck also runs Chalice instead of any of the other Regalis pieces, and I think I agree. Being able to just Persona Ride on a turn where your opponent just has nothing and you essentially cripple them to essentially 0 cards in hand. If your opponent can't ride, then unlucky, right? So I think Blankmire, you know, I think it is strong. I don't think it's a tier 0 deck, but, you know, a lot of people think it's like the boogeyman of the format. It really isn't. I think this deck is formidable, but I think, you know, if they gave this card one extra card to patch up its weakness, this deck would be insane. But yeah, let's not talk about that at the moment. Then looking at the Varga list, I think Varga really benefited off this new grade 1. This new grade 1 essentially sacks itself to draw a card when something else is retired, and I think that's really, really strong. But otherwise, you know, it's just other ways to be able to get rid of your board. This player played 4 of the unique grade 3 that essentially sits on the board, but pretty much everything else is, you know, maxed out, right? Bottle Axe at 3 in the main deck, which is, you know, formidable. The Restander grade 1, the Bolt grade 1. Yeah, very, very straightforward. I think this deck is very, very strong. So if you're picking it up for set 1, I highly recommend picking up this deck. Probably do a deck profile on that in the very, very near future. Then, looking at the Ultimate Vanguard Cup, this is the 9th one, and this is a singles format. So, singles format showing a lot of Nadir, a lot of Razel, Blankmire, and Direful Dolls. Direful Dolls did get a new grade 2, which is... I didn't think the grade 2 would be that impactful to the deck, but, you know, I might have guessed wrong. And then pretty much like a bunch of other one-offs, right? And then the first player was a DRAJEWELED player. Second was Razel. Third was Varga. Fourth was Blankmire. Top 8 consisted of Shunui, Blankmire, Direful Dolls, and Mygo. So just looking at the Blankmire list, this is very similar, kind of similar. So it runs the old Cycler card instead of capitalizing on the new one. Only 3 for Alcracia. 1 less of the grade 3 order. I think the grade 3 order being at 3 is really nice. 4 is really excessive. I think 3 is a nice number to be able to see it. But otherwise, yeah, this is very similar to the list that we saw before. They're looking at... this is another DRAJEWELED list. I mean, Blankmire list. So this Blankmire list, very, very similar to the first list, except this one runs the old Cycler instead of the new Cycler. I can see its benefits, but I think the new Cycler just has a little bit better resource management or easier resource access to be able to, I guess, achieve what it needs to achieve. This one runs the Bracing Angel Light instead of the Chalice. I think the Chalice capitalizes this deck really, really well. You don't really care too much about the Bracing Angel Ladder too much. So that's that. And then the Direful Doll list. So this list is, you know, ever-changing. That's the word, ever-changing. So this list plays 2 of the new grade 2s. Essentially, when it attacks, you put a Direful Doll from drop zone into Soul, and it gains 5k for each grade, if I'm not mistaken. And then on hit, retire 1. So I think the into Soul is really strong, because then it essentially binds itself. So having a heavy hitter on a rearguard first to essentially chain into your multi-attack is very strong. Before, you essentially had to solely rely on this, but now that numbers can get even higher. So essentially you can go like plus 15 on this thing by putting a grade 3 into Soul. So pretty much you put a grade 3 into Soul plus 15 plus Persona is like 35 by itself, which is really, really fat. And then pretty much everything else just kind of comes from, like, I guess the old deck. This deck plays the red OT. I think the red OT is very strong in this deck, purely because sometimes your rear guards, you don't actually get rid of them, you just keep them there, and then if you hit the red OT, you can choose not to give like 5k using this card, or plus 10k using this card, so it doesn't bind itself. So you pretty much attack 100 million first, restand 100 million plus the 10k, and then binds itself to draw a card, right? So yeah, lots of innovations with Direful Dolls. I didn't actually think this card alone would make this deck really good, but you know, I guess I was wrong, and you know, it's showing results. Maybe I just like pick up Dieful Dolls for Springfest in like a later Springfest or something. I don't know. We'll work it out. I actually do want to check out the DRAJEWELED list. I completely forgot to open up the DRAJEWELED list. So this list is exactly the same as the first place list for the Book Off Toreka Festival. I think it's the same player. So yeah, like, you know, Ristal Gala and Nocturcia, essentially if you use Forbidol, you essentially want the second one to be able to find it out. And it's good because you can just filter your hand and just like spot retire. I think that's really strong. This deck doesn't run fronts. Did the other one run fronts? No, so it's just full on 8 crit. You really don't care, right? If you hit a crit, it's actually really strong, like post the Vanguard skill, because then your opponent essentially has to guard 2 nearly unguardable rear guards, which is, yeah, ridiculous. So yeah, that's pretty much all the results we had over this weekend. I think Philippines is this week. We also have Vancouver as well, so lots of, you know, results to come. So we'll be covering those on this channel. I probably will start to release some of the comprehensive guides for the new stuff in set 1, and probably gotta start testing that because it's actually relevant to the next Springfest I am going to. If you guys like this video, pop a like, comment down below what you guys think of everything that we covered in this video. What, you know, struck out to you, because I think the real big deck that struck out to me was DRAJEWELED, and the fact that it came first in 2 events straight off the bat from set 2 is actually pretty surprising. So I wouldn't be surprised if this deck picked up in popularity. So, you know, if you guys are looking for Ignis, make sure you get them now, and, you know, really capitalize this for set 2. If you guys haven't already, click that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.